When you think of the word necromancer, particularly in relation to the fantasy genre, what do you think? I think of lurid darkness, the allure of playing with the most primal forces in existence, death and entropy, and contorting them, turning what was once a straightforward process into a subversion of power. But necromancers, as presented in many works of fantasy fiction, are also obviously, blatantly evil. This is easy to enforce, particularly given their dress sense. Some wear skulls, most are fond of sweeping black cloaks and the darkness of night. Bleached white bones contrasts with the drooping, mottled flesh of the dead. The once dead struggle to remember how to walk, and their actions are performative, performed in service of the necromancers who leverage this most awesome of powers in the service of more power. They should be forces of nature, truly indomitable beings whose presence in a story upends the status quo and creates a deep uncertainty about one's own life, and whether it is right to quest against the inevitability of death. Yet, the necromancers in Oblivion are not like that. The world of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion is, for the most part, relatively safe fantasy. It is constructed of tropes we've seen many times before, albeit bundled in an elegantly ugly, fun package. It is a broad world made up of interlocking systems that, while they are prone to failure, create a simulationist feel to the world. Particularly for me when I was younger, these simulationist elements, perhaps as simple as they might now feel, and as absurd and bug-ridden as the AI became because of them, added dynamism. They created the impression that the world was different every time I played it, that because the characters had routines and moved around town, they were able to present at least the illusion of a world that lived without me. The cities that these weird characters lived in were legitimate safe havens for a younger, much more easily frightened me. They were bastions against the untamed, demon-filled wilds of Cyrodiil. It was, for a surprisingly long time, a world that, for me, was demarcated by the safety of civilization versus the true unknown, the hostility of the wilds. Worse than that was the fact that all around me was the evidence of the power of the wilderness. Venturing out of the cities or the sparse villages, one finds all kinds of ruins. Ruins of the ancient elven Ayleid civilization, toppled in countless years past. There are caverns of mines that no longer function and are inhabited by raiding goblins. There are, perhaps worst of all, the direct evidence of the failings of the Empire that you are nonetheless entrusted to save in the game's main quest. There is a strange, perhaps even awkward, disconnect between what we hear about the glory of the Empire and the desolate nature of the landscape of Cyrodiil. Fortresses, even placed in the middle of roads, such as Fort Ash on the route to Corel from the Imperial City, are not manned by any Imperial soldiers or local guards. They don't even sit abandoned. They have been invariably claimed by one faction or another. Fort Ash, for example, is occupied by goblins. But there are much worse things than goblins. At least there were for a younger me. Take, for instance, Fort Lynchel. It is fairly remote, built to the north of a city which was massacred before the game even began. It has, perhaps, been ruined for centuries, cited as it is in a necromancer's handbook as a place to go to create the soul-stealing gems that capture sentient souls. There are altars with corpses on them, skulls jammed on pikes, and walking skeletons marching just outside the doors. But nonetheless, it has the trappings of imperial splendor. That splendor can be nostalgic, but also like a siren's call. Ruins are unique, as Paul Zucker argues, since the emotional impact of ruins is ambiguous. We cannot say whether they belong aesthetically in the realm of art or in the realm of nature. The ruins of this mouldering fortress contain a symbolically resonant kind of enemy, the necromancers. They are, much more potently than perhaps your humble bandit or marauder, symbols of resurrection, of an obsession with death to such a degree that they live amongst it. Worse, they pervert the cycle of decay by changing the certainty of death into something else. Florence M. Hetzler writes in their article Causality, Ruin Time and Ruins about the castle of Siegfried de Raschewilz, the grandson of Ezra Pound. Hetzler continues, saying that the castle provides a good example of what I term a ruin. One cannot say where that nature ends. One is aware of clouds, snow-capped mountains, and wildflowers, the sound of hand scythes as the farmers cut the hay, the sound of cowbells as the cows go down a path near the castle, the movement of the black and white cows and the maids who lead them down the path, the musty smell within the walls, and the touch of the ruins includes the experience of oppressive heat and the presence of sheep, goats, and shepherds, as well as the edifice itself. One is also aware of the fact that the castle is placed on top of a mountain and stands as a presence in the shape of a great ship. Instead of being surrounded by water, its location is enhanced by fir trees and the sound of birds. The walk up to the mountain, to the ruin, is also part of the ruin. This castle is a ruin, whereas Schloss Bronnenberg in Murano, Italy, where Siegfried de Raschewitz lives with his family, is a ruined ruin. The ruin isn't ruined any longer. It has been reclaimed. Necromancers create these ruined ruins naturally. Rather than leaving the body to decay or the spirit to pass on and become something new, they draw them back to the earth, making them perform like puppets or act as monsters. Within the world of fantasy, necromancers are uniquely perverse, disallowing our cultural concept of the end, refusing the junction between human and nature that always erodes the human, creating ruins out of our bodies, edifices from our bones. With that in mind, the zombies within Oblivion were always so striking to me, because they are so obviously monstrous. Hideous green flesh, with exposed innards looming out of both their bodies in the darkness, these zombies lurch with a surprising speed to their gait and make horrible noises that accompany them. They are genderless, yet visibly, identifiably human. They are the second enemy type fought in the game. The tutorial dungeon is made up of rats, up until the player rounds a corner and meets one of these nasty-looking creatures. It is one of my earliest brushes with horror and fantasy video games, and it worked. Skyrim's Draugr have nothing on them. Their monstrous features are so simply done. In a way, they are zombies at their most raw and effective. The vision of the body destroyed and distorted by death, an obviously dead body, is distinct. The rest of the dungeon has goblins, sure, and they stuck a goblin head on their goblin magic staff, but they are not as exact reflections as a human zombie. I will always remember Cadlu Chapel as well. Fort Lynchol is so distant, so isolated, and almost forgotten. It is a ruin that became ruined a long time ago. The walking corpses within them, and the necromancers that occupy the place, may be ruins in motion, with corpses on altars and cauldrons full of skulls, but they themselves are couched in a kind of comfort. The disaster that struck this place, this monument, has passed. All that remains, in comparison, are small evils. We can deal with those with blade and with axe. We can deal with evil with blade and axe in Cadlu Chapel too, but the evil is much more recent, much more pervasive. We get the impression that we could have saved them somehow if we'd arrived there earlier. Two necromancers have killed and looted their way through what we can presume was once a humble chapel on the edge of Nibbin Bay. These ruins were striking to me because the icon on the map was one I should have been able to trust. It was the symbol of civilization, not a ruin or a dungeon, yet it had been destroyed. The symbol remained the same though. Periodically, I would return to this place and kill whichever new necromancers had come to occupy it. Necromancers, of course, feature large in the Mages Guild quest line, where they become the central antagonists. I always found them wobbly and unconvincing while playing through the quest. They are easily defeated, and their boasts, far from making them more threatening, merely make them sound like whiny brats, unsure, unconfident in their power. One of them, their leader in fact, Manny Marco, rattles off boasts about your vain attempts to destroy me, but is felled in probably less than a minute afterwards by almost every player. These enemies, which are supposed to be so lurid, so taboo, end up as nothing more than fodder for the sword of the adventurer or their spells. Necromancers are, historically, very interesting. They were an intermediary between our world and the spirit world. For the Western world, these ancestral beliefs come from the Greeks and Romans. Given that this is Western fantasy, it is worth examining this tradition briefly. Daniel Ogden, in his book Greek and Roman Necromancy, writes that death, the dead, and eschatology were subjects of infinite interest and reflection, and consequently, subjects of many contradictory attitudes. In such a context, it was inevitable that necromancy or something like it should thrive, and that it should itself, in turn, be a topic of much thought and of much contradiction. Necromancy, in reality, is a way of coming to terms with and examining death and what it means to us as human beings. If the resurrection of the dead was universally available and possible, I do not believe I would necessarily be in favour, due to my own personal beliefs about the importance, however terrifying, about a natural, inevitable end to one's life. Necromancy was a way of examining that. Provocatively, Ogden writes, in other words, the pressing question at the broad psychosociological level is not why did the ancients practice necromancy, but why don't we practice it? In other words, why is necromancy as a concept so distant to us today, so relegated to the aisles of fantasy fiction? In a world where death is just as mysterious as it has always been, just relegated to the periphery of our ever-busy modern minds, should we not all be trying to communicate with the dead? Perhaps a resurrection or ritual is a step too far, but death as a subject is itself one we all try to step away from, even unconsciously. Horror, I find, is a good way to get closer, to strengthen our resilience and our ties to death. We have to understand it, or rather, accept it, I think, to live a rewarding life. Necromancers are such a good idea within fantasy fiction, regardless of how they appear in actuality. I think I probably first encountered the idea of necromancers, or at least evil sorcerers, within the pages of Fighting Fantasy, the gamebook series that ran from the 1980s to the mid-1990s. The book Temple of Terror, for example, has a fairly one-note evil sorcerer known as Malbordus. The image of Malbordus rising slowly from a pit in the ground is fantastic, because firstly I think it speaks to a stereotype of the evil wizard just perfectly, but that can't have just been it. Malbordus rising from the ground is a promise of darkness, of something unfathomably powerful and malevolent. But he's also afforded that status because he's embedded within a static narrative. The dark necromancers and sorcerers of those gamebooks are fallible and are meant to be defeated by the player, but they're also generally competent, threatening, and quiet, looming presences in each story. The stories are shorter than 100-hour-long RPGs, meaning that they can be scarcer on the combat, and they can have enemies appear as more distinct threats than in a lengthier action-adventure RPG like Oblivion. When a truly threatening enemy does appear, they can act within the bounds of your imagination in Fighting Fantasy. When you face off against a necromancer boss enemy in other video games as well, they are often threatening, imposing, and probably speak only a few words. That's how they remain cool, by shutting up. But in Oblivion, they spout hackneyed, vain boasts until they are slain. They are all flawed. To make these figures, even by accident, supposedly representations of the nature of evil and death themselves, to make them weak, distinctly human entities is a choice that, I think, works, despite my argument to the contrary just a minute ago. Because these necromancers, far from being representations of evil, manifestations of humankind's collective dark desire to break the shackles of death, well, these are just people, the same silly people that we've been bumping into in the cities. Misguided ones, and still pretty cartoonishly evil, but the fact that they've got nothing to show beneath their bravado makes Oblivions some of the most unique necromancers in video games, I think. They are, on the one hand, empty, vacuous enemies who summon undead and try to constantly flee players in order to fire off more annoying spells, or, in their more foolish moments, run straight into a trap. They populate the entirety of a side questline, and still feel remarkably ineffective. It is all just made worse by their boasting, which never seems to stop. They are monsters who believe they are gods. But, on the other hand, when they are defeated and the player rises to the top of the Mages Guild in Cyrodiil, the necromancers still populate the world. Independent cells still crop up in Fort Lynchell, Cadlu Chapel, and other such pockets of the wilderness. I often wondered about them. What drew them to the cause? They are, of course, just meaningless enemies generated as fodder for you, the great hero, to slay. Within the overarching narrative of Oblivion, the necromancers are an underground movement. With the practice banned from the Mages Guild in some effort to sanitize the outward look of the guild, they drive the study onwards underneath the surface. Suddenly lawless, these various necromancers take flight and become generic enemies to be slain. They are forces who are demonized within the game world and made pathetic by their inefficacy. There is one real obvious exception to this rule, and that is the High Elf known as Falcar. He is at one point the leader of the Cheydinhal chapter of the Mages Guild. Cheydinhal is a small city in the province of Cyrodiil, and the quest line in that city for the Mages Guild is one that revolves around investigation. Falcar asks you to swim into a well behind the guild and retrieve a ring, but when you go to get the ring, you find that someone is already down there. A corpse. The corpse of a previous student who somehow failed Falcar's little test. He picked up the ring and found it unexplainably heavy. So heavy, in fact, that he drowned trying to take it out, and didn't just put it down for whatever reason. When you, the player, inevitably circumvent Falcar's murderous trick, you return to the guild to find him gone. He flees, so visibly cartoonishly evil as to be almost a parody. He was a total jerk, aloof and mocking. It comes as no surprise that he is evil. Oblivion often signals its villains in this way, deserving of comeuppance because they violated social norms or some such thing. Falcar is yet another pathetic necromancer who has no backup plan, no extra scheming spell he can throw out to deal with you. He reappears briefly as an enemy in a quest much later on in the whole Mages Guild storyline, but he is pretty easily slain. Nonetheless, you can sense the promise in the idea of Falcar, right? Then you have, finally, curiously, the case of this obscure NPC known as Baeralorn. Baeralorn is a wood elf mage who serves as the court mage in the far western port city of Anvil, which is one of my favourite places in the game. It is scenic and yet melancholic, and resides at the edge of the world. When I was younger, I saw Anvil as the final point of the world, that beyond it there was nothing. That when I had explored the highlands surrounding it, I had, in some small way, conquered the known world. What a fantastic feeling that was. But Baeralorn, he's a complete and utter nobody. He has no greater part to play. He hardly has any real, unique dialogue. His introductory line is about it, and it's painfully dull. "I'm Baeralorn," he says. "Anvil's castle mage. Perhaps you've heard of my work on magical resistances." No offense to the man, he does have an awesome haircut. But he's so forgettable. So horrific, even. Unlike Anvil and the exquisite beauty and adventure that surrounds it, there's no substantive feeling to Baeralorn. He is on the surface the ultimate in non-player character design, seemingly a total void, insubstantial. Yet the game marks him inside the code as part of the Necromancers cult faction, the same as Falcar is marked later on in the game. The factions essentially tell the character who to side with during certain combat sequences. They don't attack members of their own faction unless forced by a frenzy spell. So Baeralorn, this absolute nothing nobody of a character, who spends 3 hours a day outside from 2 till 5, and then, after having dinner, spends literally all night from midnight till 6 AM studying necromancy. Sure, the game doesn't exactly show it as necromancy per se. He doesn't have skulls or effigies strung up in his room. There are no grotesque blood rituals or corpses. He doesn't rise from the floor like a Malbordis, or even have anything cool to say or to do. But he functions in the end as a character illustrative of the best of world design mixed with world building. Baeralorn has a forbidden necromantic text in storage. He performs quiet experiments, there's a bit of mort zombie flesh on his desk, then he sleeps from 6 AM till 12 PM. He does this because necromancy is a demonized practice. But not demonized in the way the Darkest Dungeon necromancer is, say. That necromancer is a void, clad in a cloak and a hood. But in Oblivion, necromancers aren't cool. They're a bunch of rebellious chumps who lurk in these distant ruins. Baeralorn reveals the one and only possibility, to my knowledge, that necromancers in Oblivion might be something else. But he also doesn't create ruined ruins without a player provoking him. He does not shatter death or summon zombies or skeletons on his own. He doesn't have any overarching place in the narrative nor scheming plot for him to fulfill. He is still a necromancer only when the player decides to fight him. And why you would, I have no idea. Game industry veteran Wolfgang Walk says that game and story are not separate aesthetic categories. But in Oblivion, necromancers and the threat they pose narratively do not align with the mechanical threat that they pose. The necromancer cult's influence on the world is minimal. Their threat level might start at the intriguing stage, but they become more and more sad the longer you face them. Famously, the necromancers who invaded the island where mage staffs are made are so boastful that their ineptitude provokes laughter.
What have we here? Another plaything? You'll dance for me, little one. Yes, you will. I will make your corpse dance and then tear itself apart.
But worst of all is Manny Marco again, whose final presence on the screen is that of a limp noodle. His vain proclamations do not match with his mechanical deficits. The developers did not give him nearly enough defenses for the abuse the player is able to hurl at him at the late stage that they're going to finish the Mage's Guild questline. I find that mechanics triumph over narrative in video games. Whatever the story is trying to tell you should align with the mechanics of the game. Whenever that does not happen, we have a conflict. The reality of the game confronts us as a player. The reality of Manny Marco destroys the necromancer's finest hour in Oblivion, which is when he and his cult storm the Bruma Mages Guild Hall and kill everyone there, barring one survivor who was invisible. But the survivor relays. I couldn't believe my eyes. I think the only reason I'm alive is because I was invisible, but even so I think he saw me. He killed them, one by one. Valinaro was last, I think. He was trying to run away, but he didn't make it, did he? The King of Worms stood over him right before he died, and well, it looked like he sucked out Valinaro's soul. He said something about Echo Cave and destroying the Mages Guild. Then he looked right at me and grinned. And what else is there to say but how chilling is that? You wander through the flaming wreckage of a building that was once peaceful and calm and welcoming, destroyed by an evil death cult, and find that this necromancer is so evil, so powerful, he can suck out a person's soul and see through cloaks of pure invisibility. A significant portion of the Mages Guild plot is dedicated to resisting Manny Marco's greatest power, to turn people into a thrall just like that, seemingly with a click of his fingers. The King of Worms is meant to be a figure that, in the game's lore, can rupture the space-time continuum and contest the throne of gods. In fact, he becomes the god of worms at one point and is supposed to still be a deity of a kind when you face him in Oblivion. The political reality set up by the game is more interesting than the story the game is ever allowed to tell. The framing is great. Here we have a story about an outlawed scholarly practice, however flawed or stereotypically evil it is. There should have been a stronger undercurrent of betrayal and uncertainty. Who can you trust? You could have had some deeper meaning to Falcar, a greater arc for him. What if Falcar, or an equivalent, had been someone who slowly decayed as the story went on, someone whose faith in the system was shattered over time? What if necromancy had been something not just luridly dark, something outwardly, malevolently, patently evil, but something that had manifested as a scholarly desire? Something that wasn't just blatant, but either a curiosity, or something akin to maybe how this dark side is presented in Star Wars, a road paved with good intentions, as they say. But it is no use speaking in these hypotheticals. Oblivion released in 2006, a world away from me writing and dictating this piece now. The necromancers in Oblivion are figures ultimately like Baeralorn. They exist in the shadows of the world, scuttling around in ruins or backrooms, and who flinch from the light. They exist either to be slain or to be ignored. Their few dastardly feats are overshadowed by their unending incompetencies. Manny Marco is so poorly presented as a final boss for a questline it is hard to believe. He is a far cry from the power posited by necromancers like the fighting fantasy villain Lord Mortis from the Keep of the Lich King, who raises armies from the dead even 200 years after his demise, and whose threat is taken adequately seriously. Descriptions of villages of terrified people and letters of brave last stands. But without mechanical reinforcement from Oblivion, necromancers do not have the bite to back up the bark. The only mechanically interesting things the necromancer cult has are the black soul gems, which can store humanoid souls and bestow more powerful enchantments. But yet again, the rarity of the gems is not enough, I think, to facilitate a kind of taboo in the Staff of Worms. When I was much younger, and Oblivion was perhaps my first proper Western RPG playing on my PlayStation 3, the Staff of Worms felt like my first glimpse into the world of console commands. I could bring people back from the dead? All of a sudden, I felt like I understood the quest for power that Manny Marco pursued, but then it came crashing back down. One target for 30 seconds? That hardly feels like the end point of power. merely the start. Game studies scholar Beat Suter et al. Write that many developers, however, do not only identify storytelling as a game mechanic, but rather as a method of structuring games into storylines that allow them to organize the flow of a game. Suter quotes another game studies scholar, Carlo Fabricatore, who says that developers see storytelling as a way of conveying meaning. Suter continues, but meaning can also be conveyed through motivating game mechanics, as evidenced by so-called emergent storytelling, which has become important in many newer games. Necromancers are not difficult opponents. They run away and pepper you with ineffectual spells, summoning monsters that you can run past just as you hack at their back as they flee. They are totally ineffectual. The longer I think about them, the worse it is. The motivation to defeat them is not to understand them, or even really to get their loot. It's not great. What is it then? Maybe it is to understand them. Perhaps in Oblivion, that's all we have, a motive that we ourselves make up. Is it enough? It's not really a motivating game mechanic per se. But ultimately, it's really up to you to decide why we should confront these necromancers. So still, when I think necromancer, I think lurid darkness. Despite all of that malevolence, despite the potential for powerful mages with ancient spells, at the back of my mind, some part of me knows that necromancers are, weirdly, people too, or they were at any rate. The vile murders and desecration performed at Cadlu Chapel is still couched in the knowledge that these are people on the very fringe. Despite how evil they are, despite their immoralities and their quest for immortality and power, they really are just these weird, pathetic loners. They spout their one-liners, sure, but they squat in darkness, subsisting on the things they steal from those commoners foolish enough to stumble into caves. These necromancers in Oblivion just seem to be people who barely know how to socialize, who live on the fringes of society. People with aspirations for power, desires to be somebody. In another world, Oblivion's necromancers could have been subjects of a study on radicalization at the fringes of society. As they are, they're a category of enemy whose presence defies the previous characterization and tropes that I'd come to expect. They are not the hyper-competent, super-cool sorcerers I had read about in books before. They were just lacking somehow. But in that lack, somehow, necromancers in Oblivion became more interesting than they ever had a right to be. Hi everyone. It's been a long time, I know. Months since I uploaded on the main channel, and over 6 months since I uploaded a video essay. It really wasn't meant to be that way, I promise, but the last 6 months really took their toll on my mental health, and I did have to step away for a while. But I did keep streaming, and now I'm back making video essays, hopefully swinging. This video is going to be the first in a new series that looks at monsters, some infamous, others obscure, across various video games, and injects academic theory into analysing the themes that these monsters and the games they are in allow. It was also originally a conversion of a post I did on my blog a year ago, except enhanced, expanded, and rewritten in places. Next, I'll convert my other blog post from the same series into video form, I reckon, but I also have other plans for video essays this year. Siren Blood Curse, Doki Doki Literature Club, Fear and Hunger 2 Termina, Silent Hill Shattered Memories, Pathologic, and maybe more if I'm feeling audacious. 1 or 2 will be longer, but I'm hoping to make most of them shorter than the 2-hour behemoths I released last year, if just for my own sanity. I hope you enjoy the shorter format, less than 1 hour, because that's what I'll be aiming for mostly this year. I say now. Thanks very much to my wonderful patrons, Blue Voices, Frankaloons, Future Cityscape, and Yjove, whose support has kept me going and kept my passion for the channel alive, even when I was deeply struggling with burnout. If you want to subscribe to my Patreon, that would be wonderful. I'd really appreciate the support, and you can also chat to me on Discord if you do subscribe. Happy to talk about any horror game. I'd love to see you there. Thanks also to my friend, you know who you are, for keeping me sane last year. I couldn't have made it here without you. And thanks to my partner for going above and beyond and always being there for me. This video, as with everything I make, is a product of time, effort, and love. Thanks to everyone for watching. I'll see you next time. Looking forward to it. Stay safe.